The next speaker has an organic connection with Callan, pretty much in the same way as Kathy Wyckoff had with Washington, though not exactly the same, because in fact it's his father that was born in Callan. But his father came from a family of very adventurous types who have never denied their association with Callan, and in fact are probably could be called the leading family to emerge from the town in recent times. Most people know his uncle, the playwright Tom Kilroy. His uncle John is a businessman in Kilkenny City, well respected and regarded by all. His father, however, was a clerk senior clerical officer in the service of the Irish Parliament in Leinster House. So he was probably a man who didn't really make much of a mark on the world because most of his dealings were with parliamentarians, therefore relatively private. But he did leave a little vignette of his life in a college magazine, and one that I was able to bring to his son's attention. His son is, from another aspect of Irish-American connection, the man who, having done his academic studies in Ireland, went to America to become famous and learned, and relatively speaking, succeeded, because he's now an associate professor of history at Nova Southeastern University. He took a strange academic path to that by making his first focus of study an African-American colonel in the military diplomatic service. But in any case, he has taken a great interest in the activities of American presidents in Ireland and their significance. He has spoken already on this subject in Kilkenny, and I'm glad he can be with us today, Dr. David Kilroy.
All right, very good. So this research, as I say, I've been working on this for a few years. I'll try to give you a kind of a truncated version. I know it's late in the day. Just give you the general gist of it, but also talk a little bit about these presidential visits to Ireland. It's a little bit different, obviously, than what we've been talking about today. Most of the presentation so far have focused on Irish people coming to America and playing a pivotal role in shaping the White House. This research focuses on occupants of the White House going to Ireland in an effort to shape their image in the United States. So as you can see, there have been 6 presidents in the modern era who have made state visits to Ireland. Right? That's an awful lot for a country that is neutral and small and of no real economic significance to the United States, certainly in the pre-EU era. There's only been 4 presidents, current occupant included, 5 presidents who have not made that visit, right, in this time period. So, one of the things that drew me to this is why so many US presidents include Ireland on their travel itineraries, right? Today, of course, presidents travel routinely, but in the Kennedy and even in the Nixon era, it was not common for presidents to take overseas trips. So to include a small country like Ireland is significant. Most scholars, when they pay attention to these visits at all, tend to conclude that these are vote-getting exercises, and that's certainly the opinion that the press and the public, I think, in general, on both sides of the Atlantic, take. When Obama visited Ireland in 2011, for example, the New York Times posited that he was, quote, retracing the steps of President Kennedy, Reagan, and Clinton, thus endorsing this supposition. I think this kind of conclusion blurs the significance of some of these visits, and I think tends to undermine the significance of others. The Clinton and Bush visits to Ireland were foreign policy visits. Clinton visited 3 times. All 3 visits were connected to the Northern Ireland peace process. In fact, as most people are probably well aware, the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 is probably not possible without the Clinton White House intervention and these visits. Bush's visit was hardly a visit at all. It was a US-EU summit, and he spent the whole time in Dromoland Castle and never exited out. But the other four are, I think, all tied together, right? And they begin with, obviously, Kennedy's visit to Ireland in 1963. The other three visits that I separate out here, the Nixon, Reagan, and Obama visits, all bear such striking similarities that I think they form part of a presidential tradition in Ireland. They're what I call part of the Dunganstown legacy, because Kennedy's visit was really focused on his roots in Wexford, and in particular his familial connections in this tiny place, Dunganstown. There's no doubt that these visits are tied to elections. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about that. The timing is geared all around elections. Kennedy came with what he was expecting to be his re-election bid in '64 on the horizon. Nixon came during, right before the midterm elections in 1970. Obama and Reagan both came right before their re-election campaigns. Even Clinton's visits were timed around elections. But I guess my point is that it's too simplistic to conclude that these are just efforts to get Irish American votes. I think there's something deeper in these visits. The Irish American vote itself is kind of problematic, right? Every time you read one of the accounts of these stories in the press or in scholarly coverage of it, they will cite this figure of 40 million, or today it's 45 million people in the United States who claim Irish ancestry. Right? That seems like a huge pool of voters for that an American president could possibly impress by going to Ireland, but it's a misleading figure. Right? Of those 45 million people who claim Irish ancestry in the United States today, well over half of them are Protestant, and a great many of them trace their roots to the Scots-Irish who came to this country in the colonial era or in the period of the early republic. Right? When people think of the Irish American vote in the modern history of the United States, it is the Irish Catholic vote that they're talking about. It's the people who came to the United States in the famine or post-famine era. Right? Even among those people, they aren't a homogenous, monolithic voting bloc, right? That may have been true in the era of Al Smith. It might even have been true in the era of John F. Kennedy, but it wasn't true by the time Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan, and definitely not by the time Barack Obama came to Ireland. Right? Irish American voters today are not a single voting bloc. Right? They vote the way most Americans do. They're split, roughly 50-50. Right? And I think the other thing about this 45 million figure that's misleading is that since the early 2000s, U.S. Census has allowed you to indicate multiple ethnicity, and so a great many people who register themselves as Irish or are counted in that 45 million figure are 20% Irish, 20% German, 20% Italian, whatever else. Right? So I don't think I don't think it's sound analysis to conclude that these visits are solely vote-getting exercises aimed at an Irish American voting bloc. The other factor to take into consideration here too is that Kennedy didn't need those votes. Right? He won them all in 1960. Right? It's true that Nixon was in the process of shearing Irish Americans away from the traditional base in the Democratic Party and bringing them into the Republican Party in the early 70s, and that's certainly what Reagan succeeded in doing in 1980. So it could be argued he was, attempting to solidify that process in '84. But as I say, by the time Obama comes around, the notion of being able to pull this block in one direction or another is misleading. These are carefully choreographed visits. They're stage managed. They're basically actions of political theater. But the theater is aimed at all Americans, or at least a great many Americans, and not just Irish Americans, right? My basic thesis is that what these visits are about are American presidents forging a certain identity among the American voting public. And it's an identity that represents significant shifts in how Americans understand themselves and identity politics in America in the post-war period. Let me just begin with the Kennedy visit, and then I'll try and explain this process a little bit. In addition to inaugurating this pattern of U.S. presidential travel, Kennedy established a certain rhetorical narrative that his successors would embrace. Much of the U.S. coverage treated the visit, as I said, as a vote-getting exercise or even as a personal interlude. But there was a story in the Los Angeles Times during the Kennedy visit that I think got to the heart of the matter. This story, the reporter noted, Kennedy's journey home, stopping at his great-grandfather's ancestral home in Duncanstown, County Wexford, was showcasing his family's humble origins in rural Ireland before a huge television audience and a print media audience too. It was only a few hours out of a 4-day trip, but Duncanstown was the most widely covered aspect of Kennedy's stay. And I think I have a picture here of the Kennedy arriving. I think that picture is actually Cork, it's not Dublin. But the bottom right-hand picture is Kennedy in Duncanstown with the cup of tea by the fireplace, meeting the cousins, right? This was a very small part of a much larger trip, but it was the most covered and most talked about element of the trip, but certainly arguably the most choreographed as well. The story of the Kennedy family's rise from rags in Ireland to riches in the United States had a familiar ring for many Americans. And so, ironically, by going to Ireland, Kennedy was able to dispel some of the doubts about his Americanism that had been clearly evident during his campaign for election. Even his Catholicism, which had been such a contentious issue during the campaign, seemed less alien in this context. It's been reported that the only time during the course of his presidency that Kennedy made the sign of the cross was during this 4-day visit to Ireland. Right? It's the only time where he publicly acknowledged his Catholicism. The electoral value of Ireland's visit had less to do with securing Irish American votes and more to do with reshaping his image among American voters. At Duncanstown, Kennedy embraced new symbols of American identity and, I think, revised deeply rooted and widely held perceptions of core American values. We were talking earlier, it was mentioned earlier about how Emerson's quote about Europe extending to the Alleghenies and America beginning after, and I think that's very apropos to what I'm going to talk about here, in the sense that for much of American history, certainly in the post-Jackson era, once Andrew Jackson becomes president, the post-Jackson era, a certain cultural element, entered the biographies of American presidents, right? Jackson, when he became president, brought to the White House this image of a folksy America, right? Somebody born in a log cabin, an average person, as opposed to the East Coast elites who had occupied the White House before. And in the post-Jackson era, it becomes the vogue for everyone running for the White House to build a biography which somehow includes some log cabin credentials, right? And this log cabin myth persists throughout the 19th century, right? And into the 20th century. This idea that to be an American president, to represent the American people, you had to be of this frontier log cabin background, right? And generally speaking, what that meant was that you were of British stock, Protestant in religion, and that excluded a great many people in the early 20th century, and right through to the time of Kennedy. Right, Kennedy and his family were very cognizant of what happened to Al Smith in 1928, and Smith, the first Catholic to run for president, had lost a great chunk of support in his own party, largely because I think his biography was not correct. Right, so what I'm trying to get at here is I think Kennedy, when he goes to Ireland, reshapes that log cabin story, and there's other elements to it too, because the log cabin myth is not just a story of frontier Protestantism being at the core of American identity, but also there's an element of anti-intellectualism in it, an East Coast bias. These kinds of things are very evident in that storyline, and so these are all strikes against Kennedy. Right, he's Catholic, he's Ivy League, East Coast educated, he's Irish, and so in going to Ireland, I think what Kennedy successfully does in his Dunganstown visit is reshape this story around the Ellis Island narrative, right? That the real America is not just the frontier myth, but it's the Ellis Island story, right? The concepts are the same. It's the American dream. It's pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It's overcome great challenges. But the story is different, right? So historically, I think the log cabin narrative started to make non-whites, non-Protestants, urbanites, intellectuals the other in American politics. As I say, Kennedy was Catholic, urban, Ivy League. And in this sense, his candidacy for presidency clashed with this traditional image. I should note, by the way, he's not the first person, obviously, who's East Coast urbanite, but other presidents, and particularly those who were not Irish and who were Protestant, it was easy for them to mold this image. But all occupants of the White House sought to do this. There's a famous campaign right after Jackson leaves office of William Henry Harrison, we talked about earlier, the log cabin and hard cider campaign, where Harrison and Van Buren are trading these jibes about who's more rooted in the frontier than the other. And that practice goes all the way up into the 20th century. FDR, who we just heard referenced a few minutes ago, even once tried to pass Hyde Park off as his farm, right? In an effort to create this kind of folksy image. So up to 1960, as I said, the vast majority of presidents claimed to be the scions of Protestant ancestors, come to America from Britain in the pre-revolutionary era. Kennedy was at the forefront of a broad development in the post-war period, whereby a new American narrative rooted in the story of late 19th century European immigration was superimposed and ultimately superseded this older narrative. Ellis Island came to replace the log cabin as the enduring symbol of American virtue. But the core values of American frontier remained implicitly ingrained in the huddled masses who successfully embraced the freedom and opportunity afforded them in the United States. In 1958, then Senator Kennedy responded to a request from the Anti-Defamation League to write an extended essay on immigration as part of the One Nation Library series. The resulting work, A Nation of Immigrants, offered an impassioned defense of immigration and proffered the position that ethnic pluralism was one of the United States' greatest strengths. Kennedy emphasized the consistency of the Ellis Island story with the frontier values of the early republic, writing that immigration, quote, infused a nation with a commitment to far horizons and new frontiers, and therefore kept the spirit of pioneer life, the spirit of equality and hope, always alive and strong. As one scholar notes, Kennedy's visit to Ireland, therefore, in '63 was a thrilling embodiment of this newly articulated pluralism. The White House recognized that the Kennedy family story not only contained clear ethos of the log cabin values, but that the whole visit to Ireland could be used to make Kennedy's Irishness an asset rather than a liability. By merging the immigration story with the earlier American identity myths, the Kennedy visit could be used to appeal to both ethnic Americans who traced their origins through Ellis Island and Protestant Americans who root their identity in older white Anglo-Saxon past. And Kennedy speaks to this during various public events in Ireland. In New Ross, where his great-grandfather had departed for America, he spoke to a crowd and noted that on this very spot, his grandfather had left, quote, to become a cooper in East Boston. He carried nothing with him but two things: a strong religious faith and a strong desire for liberty. Here was the revised American identity myth embodied in the story of Patrick Kennedy. And his grandson was determined to communicate that message, that all of his grandchildren valued that inheritance. Kennedy had earlier told a crowd packed into the centre of Wexford town that coming to Ireland, quote, makes me even prouder of my own country, which has welcomed so many sons and daughters of so many countries. It was a message intended more for an audience, a multi-ethnic audience on the other side of the Atlantic than the throngs in Wexford. Kennedy's carefully stage-managed four-day visit to Ireland represents conscious effort to take this immigrant story and move it from the margins into the mainstream of American politics. The White House exploited the widespread and largely passive coverage of the visit by the American media to communicate this message. Absent any critical analysis, these travel spectacles were able to draw out the message that the White House wanted to send. 70 million Americans watched coverage of Kennedy's visit to Ireland on ABC and CBS and NBC. Millions more read about it in newspapers and magazines across the country. Footage, photographs, and descriptions of Kennedy's visit with his distant cousins in Dunganstown proved particularly popular. I'm just going to read you a little quote, which is typical of the kind of coverage. This is from the St. Petersburg Times in Florida, which describes the cottage where Kennedy met his relatives as a tiny hut where, quote, the American branch of the Kennedy family had its beginnings in a moment of bold decision when voices from over the sea whispered of a new bright land of hope and promise. I don't think the White House staff could have wrote it any better in terms of getting across their message. Crosby Noyes, the foreign correspondent of the Washington Evening Star, captured the implicit meaning of the visit when he wrote that Kennedy's visit to Dunganstown evoked a spirit of genuineness, more akin to the time of Abraham Lincoln, who could be more associated with a log cabin than Abraham Lincoln, right, than to the modern era of space and television. The clearest indication, I think, that Kennedy's visit hit the right note was, of course, that several other presidents went to Ireland to try to do exactly the same thing that he did, right? Most notably Nixon and Reagan, and then later Obama. Now, Nixon's visit to Ireland in 1970, just a couple of years after Nixon visited, the Irish broadcaster RTE ran a documentary on the radio, which was titled The Forgotten Visit. And I think that pretty much sums up Nixon's 1970 visit to Ireland. For many Irish people, and I think for the Nixon White House, it was a non-event. Nixon went there, spent 3 days in Ireland, visited his, reputedly, the townland where his ancestors had lived. His family name, his relatives in Ireland are the Millhouses, right? And they were Quakers who left Ireland in the 18th century. I think the story of Nixon's visit and the efforts of the White House to replicate the kind of good feeling and goodwill that the Kennedy visit generated, speaks to the kind of stage managing and effort that went into this process. The Nixon staffers tracked down as many Millhouses in Ireland as they could. They were hoping to find a living relative. There were no living relatives. So they eventually found a cemetery in Timahoe where his ancestors were buried, although even that was open to dispute because this is Timahoe, County Kildare. There's a Timahoe, County Offaly that also claimed to have Quakers named Millhouse buried in their cemetery as well. But they settled on Timahoe, County Kildare in any case. Nixon made the visit. I think there's a number of things that strike me as really interesting about the Nixon visit. First of all, I'm not convinced Nixon was convinced himself about the authenticity of his Irish ancestry. He tended to speak more about his wife's Irish ancestry than his own. And of course, that may have been a political ploy, because her family roots are Irish Catholic, his are Irish Protestant. And I think, if there is a case to be made that anyone was going directly for that Irish Catholic vote, it's Nixon. But the fact that he went there and conducted this visit on a blueprint drawn directly from the Kennedy model, I think speaks to the significance of this new storyline, this idea that American authenticity ran through Ellis Island, right? That if you wanted to portray yourself as a man of the people, and that's of course what every president in the White House, in this era at least, wanted to do, then you had to draw these connections that made sense to a great many voters, not just Irish voters. So his target audience, like Kennedy's, was ethnic voters in America, and not just Irish voters. I think the closest he came to kind of articulating the message that Kennedy had was a kind of a few disjointed phrases he said over at the graveside of Timahoe, where he noted that 3 centuries ago, my ancestors once lived here before coming to the Pennsylvania colony before the War of the American Revolution. This is a long way from the kind of ebullient enthusiasm that marked Kennedy's visit. I think Nixon was tentative in embracing his ancestry and was kind of hedging his bet on the frontier too, by referencing his pre-revolutionary roots. Nonetheless, the idea that you could come to Ireland and weave this narrative persisted. And Reagan, I should have shown you, actually, I forgot to put up my image of Nixon. That's Nixon on his visit to Ireland. The crowds were much smaller, and I think part of Nixon's faltering in terms of embracing the authenticity of this was that the Irish people didn't necessarily embrace it as authentic either, right? So he wasn't getting the same vibe in return. And the other problem with Nixon's visit too is that he tried to avoid Dublin at all costs, because his staff told him that if you go to Dublin, you're going to face major anti-war protests, and that's not good television, right? So, but the plaque on the bottom here is was erected for the visit, and it's a reminder that Nixon did pay this visit to Timahoe. It's probably the only thing in Timahoe today that's I think worth going to see. There's not much there. Ronald Reagan, when he came, I think Reagan comes very close to replicating some of the energy of the Kennedy visit. In his remarks at Shannon Airport, Reagan left no doubt about the centrality of the immigrant narrative as a theme for his visit, stating that in coming to Ireland, quote, I am returning not only to my roots, but to America's roots. America has always been a haven of opportunity for those seeking a new life. They in turn have given to us, they have shaped us, and they've enriched us. As Matthew Fry Jacobson notes, by the time Kennedy came to Ballyporeen, such roots talk had become ubiquitous in American culture. Writing in the Washington Post, Micah Barone went so far as to assert that the upcoming 1984 election, which pitted Reagan against Democratic ticket of Walter Mondale and Geraldine Ferraro, might come down to whichever campaign could more centrally position itself within the immigrant narrative, or in Barone's words, the Ellis Island story, and thus attract more white ethnic voters. What Barone dubbed the battle for Ellis Island was not about the Irish vote or the Italian vote. It was a competition to see which candidate could more effectively embrace what was now this quintessentially American storyline. What's important in 1984, Barone continued, is not how each ticket appeals to specific ethnic groups, but which is more successful in appealing to the Ellis Island tradition generally. In an effort to do this, Reagan had begun his 1980 campaign at the Statue of Liberty, and now he was effectively launching his 1984 campaign in rural Ireland. The key act in the drama of Reagan's visit was his stopover in Ballyporeen in County Tipperary. The New York Times noted that the president's aides could not conceal their delight over the resonance that today's visit is expected to have, with many Americans who have lately become fascinated with tracing their ancestry. There was a film crew on hand to shoot commercials for campaign commercials as Reagan visited the site where his ancestral home had once stood. Once again, there were no living relatives left, and the home was gone. So, piecing together the kind of imagery required for this political pageant was a little challenging. But Reagan did make it to the Church of Assumption, where his great-grandfather, Michael Regan, was baptized in 1821. And as he walked towards the church, a marching band played the theme from Rocky. Even if there was some doubt about the validity of both sides of the Reagan homestead, or even if there's some doubt about the validity of both the site of the Reagan homestead and the baptismal records from Michael Regan, such imagery was essential to the theater of the immigrant narrative. In his remarks to the crowd at Ballyporeen, Reagan provided the accompanying script. He claimed that all of the honors afforded to him as president in coming to Ballyporeen was his most cherished, because until genealogists had uncovered his link to the area, he had been largely ignorant of his ancestry. The Irish ambassador claimed not only was he ignorant of it, but he basically refused to embrace it in the election campaign in '79. But I think he recognized how valuable it could be with '84 coming up. But Reagan explained that his own father had been orphaned at a young age, and now he exulted in the knowledge that, quote, "I know at last from whence I came." Likening his visit to Ballyporeen to coming home after a long journey, Reagan remarked how his great-grandfather had left there in time of stress, seeking to better himself and his family, but my ancestors took with them a treasure, an indomitable spirit that was cultivated in the rich soils of this country. Now he was returning as President of the United States, a descendant of people who were buried in paupers' graves. This may not have been exactly the setting which Kennedy had, but Reagan's message to voters back in the US clearly echoed the idea that Kennedy had crafted. I just want to turn to the last visit here, the Obama visit, because I think this is perhaps the most interesting one, certainly the most interesting effort to replicate the Kennedy storyline. By the time Obama came to Ireland in 2011, the story of immigration in America had entered a new chapter, and the Ellis Island narrative was receding into a bygone era. The Obama visit thus provides perhaps the most intriguing echo of the original Kennedy formula. For Obama, the potential political return from this exercise was arguably far greater than it was for Nixon and Reagan, neither of whom were ever subject to the kind of criticism or critique that Obama faced. And Reagan and Nixon both had the advantage of coming to the presidency as white Protestant candidates, right? Something which neither Kennedy nor Obama could claim. Few presidents in American history, with the possible exception of Abraham Lincoln, have faced the same level of vitriol and animosity while in office as Obama. Attacks on Obama's Americanism took many forms, from questions about his birth, to accusations that he was secretly Muslim, to the charge that he exhibited a Kenyan anti-colonial behavior. Like Kennedy, but to a greater extent, Obama came to Ireland on the back of persistent scrutiny over his heritage, with a small but vocal minority questioning not just his Americanism, but his very citizenship. In the opinion of Harvard law professor Randall Kennedy, the exotic mixture of a Kenyan father, an Arabic middle name, a Hawaiian birth, and an Indonesian education combined to transform Obama in the minds of many Americans into a Manchurian candidate whose patriotism and American identity would always be suspect. Kennedy, too, came to Ireland determined to assuage doubts about his heritage, but Obama carried with him the added burden of race and all the historical baggage that carries in the United States. Is Obama black or white? Is he African American or black American? Does Obama personify a new age of multiculturalism and hybridity in terms of racial identification? Did his presidency mark the end of a post-racial era? I'll leave you to answer those questions yourself, but you know, they have been widely debated. White Americans have historically questioned black Americans' loyalty to the United States, and many continue to do so. In Obama's case, citing among other things his wife's comments and his pastor's comments in 2008. Just a couple of closing points on this because I think it's important. Irish-American journalist Larry Donnelly captured the essence of Obama's visit in a piece published in the Irish Independent a few days before Obama arrived in Dublin. Donnelly wrote of Ireland as a place where real Americans have roots, and thus concluded that the visit would resonate with white ethnic voters in Middle America and further Americanize the president in the eyes of the most skeptical onlookers. Although Obama's visit to Ireland was cut short by the threat to air traffic from volcanic ash cloud, there was never any question of jettisoning his stopover in Moneygall, and this is where his maternal ancestors, his great-great-great-great-grandfather, Falmouth Kearney, had come from. The Moneygall visit, like the earlier presidential stopovers in Dunganstown and Timahoe and Ballyporeen, was carefully choreographed. You can see Reagan had a pint of Smithwick's. Obama had a pint of Guinness. The Moneygall visit was key to the trip. All the major TV networks and cable news channels covered it. It was, as the New York Times once again pointed out, a postage stamp Irish hamlet, a symbol of small town values, something which is apparently lacking in Obama's Hawaii-Chicago background. Later that day, speaking in College Green, Obama drew a direct line from Moneygall to America, and particularly to the American heartland, when he noted the story of his great-great-great-great-grandfather. It's remarkable to see the small town where a young shoemaker named Falmouth Kearney, my great-great-great-great-grandfather, lived his early life. He left during the Great Hunger to seek a new life in the New World. He married an American girl from Ohio. They settled in the Midwest. They started a family. It's a familiar story because it's one so loved and cherished by Americans of all backgrounds. It's integral to our national identity. It's who we are as a nation. Obama's emphasis on immigrants from all over the world marks a subtle but important departure from the standard immigrant narrative. Maureen Dowd in the New York Times noted that Obama had to make a foreign trip to seem less foreign to Americans, but concluded that after Moneygall that he succeeded in rooting himself in an ethnic working class persona. Others were less convinced. One African American blogger noted that quite flippantly that the image of Obama being welcomed enthusiastically by some of the whitest people on earth should have been able to make him less foreign to American voters, but didn't seem to change the storyline that much. I just want to turn to one more quote and then one more anecdote, and then I'll finish up. But I think in that same College Green speech, and we saw an image of that speech in an earlier presentation, Obama talked about his own father, who of course came from Kenya, not Ireland, but he connected the two stories together. In language that clearly echoed Kennedy's speech, Obama told his Dublin audience that the Kearneys worked and struggled and sacrificed and sometimes experienced discrimination to build a better life for the next generation. They passed on that faith to their children and their children's children, an inheritance that their great-great-grandchildren like me still carry with them. We call it the American dream. It's the dream that Falmouth Kearney was attracted to when he came to America. It's the dream that drew my own father from a small village in Africa. That to me is what's so interesting about the Kennedy visit, because he's basically saying, look, we've embraced the Ellis Island story. We've all accepted it as an American story. Now we have to accept the story of a village in Kenya, or for that matter, a border crossing in Mexico, or an arrival on a plane from East Asia in the same narrative. The one last anecdote I want to leave you with, of course, is that in the wake of the Obama visit, there was this huge upsurge of African-American interest in Irish ancestry. BET reported on it. There was a couple of articles written about it. But Obama's wife, Michelle, also has Irish ancestry, and this was turned up in this post-visit genealogical research. Her Irish ancestry is this was done through DNA testing, confirmed that Michelle's ancestry has been traced back to an Irish slave owner named Henry Shields, and the children he had with a slave named Melvinia. Right? In other words, for African Americans at least, Obama's Irish connection, which is authentic and real and documented, is not the common story you're going to find in the African American community, where those connections are rooted in, more often than not, Irish slave ownership. So it would be really interesting to see some point down the road another African American president who maybe had those Irish ancestral roots, how that story might be woven into this narrative. But in the short term, I think Ireland continues to be a convenient stage for American presidents who want to weave this storyline. So that's my presentation. Thank you for your patience.